Hello and welcome to this edition of the Agape Livecast. This is part 2 of a 6-part series, Whose Church Is It Really? In part 1, I talked about the fact that most churches in America, 90% of them, are nonprofit incorporations, which means that they are businesses. And in summary, I used Black's Law Dictionary and Supreme Court case Hale versus Hinkle to prove that all businesses have the state as its creator, the state as its sole authority and sovereign head, and the fact that all businesses are subject to the laws of the state, which limits its rights and powers. And today I'm going to look at why churches incorporate and the legalities and consequences of incorporation. And at the end of the video, I will definitely answer the question, does the government have the right to shut the doors of the place where I worship? So please stay tuned. Welcome again, and thank you for joining me. If you're not already a subscriber, I ask that you please hit that like button and subscribe. And to help this channel grow, I ask that you share the video. So given all that I talked about in the first video, you may be asking the question, why in the world would a church put itself under the yoke of incorporation? Why would they incorporate? Well, there are actually some pretty good reasons for it. And the number one reason that churches choose to incorporate, the number one reason churches incorporate is this. It adds a measure of legal liability protection for its membership. Incorporation shields the board of directors of the business, and thus the incorporated church, from legal liabilities in cases of lawsuits. And now this has some limitations, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit and go into more detail in episode 5. But for the most part, most, if not all states, have something in their business codes that reads something like this. The members of a corporation are not personally liable for debt, liability, or obligation of the corporation. Now, this is how Texas's business code reads. And below that, in the Tennessee Business Code, we see that a member of a corporation is not, as such, personally liable for the acts, debts, liabilities, or obligations of the corporation. Now, what does that mean? It means that the corporation is allowed to keep insurance policies, and if something happens, they have insurance to cover themselves. So if an accident occurs on the property, and we do live in an age where people like to sue, and we live in an age where people do not follow the scripture about not suing your brothers and sisters in Christ, and that's just the facts of the matter. But it also means if something happens, someone commits a crime such as sexual assault against a minor, that the corporation and the members of the board and the membership, if they get sued over that, they are protected from legal liability. If you remember in the last video, I spoke about the fact that many states required you to have a board of directors. Well, here's a screenshot of the Tennessee Code for nonprofit corporations, and it has very explicit wording. Each corporation must have a board of directors. So if you're a church in Tennessee and your church is a nonprofit corporation, then your bylaws will contain wording that have a board of directors in charge of your church. Now, that is not because it's a nice thing to have. It's because this is the law in the state of Tennessee. Now, in the state of Texas, where I was originally from, we have it in the business code, and you can see the wording here very clearly, that the board of directors means a group of persons vested with the management of the affairs of the corporation and thus the church, regardless of the name that is used to designate the group. Now, many times in churches, you will see or hear people in charge of the church, they're called the trustees. Well, that's just a term that the churches like to use. It doesn't matter what you call them in your bylaws or in your church, they are still a board of directors. Again, this is not a church, it's a business. You have to wrestle with that with your own conscience, and you have to decide if this is what the Lord intended for His church to have a board of directors. And I'm going to get into that regarding the scriptures in part 4. So I also discussed the term a registered agent. Now, a registered agent is required by all nonprofit organizations per the law, and that name is required to be filed with your state's Secretary of State. The registered agent is the person who is supposed to be notified of a lawsuit or a claim against the nonprofit. And he is the person, or she is the person of record on file to receive any legal documents against the nonprofit incorporation. So this is the Tennessee code that deals with the registered agents, but your state will likely have something similar because that's just the law, and that's pretty much in all 50 states. You may be asking yourself, what's the problem? So what? We have a board of directors. What's the downside here? From what I can see, we get protection from liability and lawsuits, and we also get a tax break. Well, I've listed some of the downside already, but I want to complete the list of consequences of being an incorporated church, and I'm going to go more into detail in part 5. One question one always has to ask oneself is this: is the risk worth the reward? Does the benefit outweigh the risk? And I will answer this question completely in part 5, but there is a statement that I want you to keep in mind until then. With the shekels comes the shackles. Nothing is free. You know, there's always a price to be paid for everything. Nothing is free in this world. And I think we all know that, especially in a system, a governmental system that's been created by the enemy. You can bet he does not have the best interest of the church in mind, and there is a price to be paid. And I also want you to remember the saying, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. You know, my dad always told me that, and I think we all know that is true. You also need to remember this: the devil is like a roaring lion, seeking who he may devour. He has set up this earthly system, and I feel that way too many churches have fallen into his trap. Remember in part 1, I pointed out the Supreme Court case of Hale versus Hinkle. And in that case, the following statements were made. The corporation is the creature of the state. It receives certain privileges and franchises which holds them subject to the laws of the state, and the corporation, being a creature of the state, has not the constitutional, or in other words, the Fourth Amendment, right to refuse to submit its books and papers for an examination at the suit of the state. So, in this case, if it's not clear enough, I want to make it crystal clear. Churches that are incorporated are legal businesses. Legal businesses have the state as its creator. The corporation is a privilege granted by the state. They are subject to the laws of the state, which limits their rights and powers. Businesses have no constitutionally protected rights, and since they have no rights, the corporation does not have a free exercise of religion. They don't have freedom of speech. They do not have the freedom of the press. They do not have the right to peaceably assemble. So a corporation, a business, does not have the right to peaceably assemble. They do not have the right to petition the government for the redress of grievances. They also do not have a Fifth Amendment right of protection against the abuse of governmental authority. Now, the only reason it appears that the church has these rights right now, I believe, is because the government is somewhat friendly to the church in most states. But I truly believe that this is going to change one day, and I'm sure that many of you do feel the same way. And I'm going to detail how that is going to happen more in part 5, but I'm going to give you a sneak preview right now. And that sneak preview is called Piercing the Corporate Veil. The board of directors of the nonprofit, and thus the members, are insulated from liabilities by what is known as the corporate veil. However, a court can set aside the corporate veil if it finds the corporation has pierced that veil. And this can include some of the following: keeping inaccurate records, such as records of your business meeting. Maybe you have misrepresented your membership data. In other words, you have not kept your membership roll up to date. Now, church, I'll ask you, are your membership rolls up to date, including the last known addresses of your members? Is it all accurate? Maybe you have failed to observe corporate formalities in terms of behavior and documentation. This means that you are not obeying your bylaws. So I'll ask this question. Do you obey and follow your bylaws? Does every business meeting follow the rules of quorum? Do you post proper notice of your bylaws and the laws of your state? Do you follow these things? If not, you have pierced the veil. Maybe there are some more sinister things happening, such as manipulation of assets and liabilities. Maybe your church has non-functioning corporate officers or directors. In other words, you have people on the books as directors or registered agents who should not be there because of some illness, whether it's some physical illness or some mental illness. And they are just there as a figurehead because they have been at the church forever. They've been very faithful. Well, that is against the law, and that is piercing the corporate veil. There are several other things that can cause a church to pierce the veil, but one thing that many churches do is this one right here. There is a treatment by an individual of the assets of the corporation as his or her own. In other words, someone, usually a staff member, uses the car or a bus or conducts some personal business with it, and this is illegal. It usually starts off sporadic and very innocent, but it becomes a habit, like it becomes their car. They go to the mall with it, or they go eat, with their spouse with the car on their own time, and this is illegal. This is piercing the veil. The bottom line is this: all churches have pierced the veil at one point or another, and I'm going to get into what this means in part 5. But it is a very dangerous thing to do. With that, let's finally answer the question, does the government have the right to shut down the doors of the place where I worship? Now, I want you to notice that I said shut down the doors of the place where I worship, not the doors of the church, because the church is a people. It's not a building. You cannot shut down the doors of a people, but you can certainly shut down the doors of a building. And the answer to this question, if you haven't figured it out already, is an unequivocal yes. Because if you are an incorporated church, which means you are a business, and in essence, you are no different than any other business, and it doesn't matter if you're a church. See, you cannot expect to get the same benefits of those other businesses, yet be treated differently than those other businesses when push comes to shove. And the simple reason is this, and I will conclude this video with one last look at Hale versus Hinkle from 1906. The corporation is a creature of the state. It receives certain privileges. Businesses receive certain privileges, and they receive certain franchises, which what? Holds them subject to the laws of the state. An incorporation, a business, and thus an incorporated church, is held subject to the laws of the state. Just like the state has a right to mandate how a hair salon conducts its business, and can close a nail salon, and can close any business for a failure to follow the business code, the sanitation code, the safety code, the state, if it so chooses, can choose to close the doors of the business you call a church, if it's incorporated. Why is a simple answer. Because there's no difference between an incorporated church and an incorporated paper company. They're both businesses. The fact that states have chosen not to treat them as such is meaningless. And I believe it's just a matter of time. Because I want you to remember, a business, according to the Supreme Court in Hale versus Hinkle, does not have constitutional rights. The tide is going to turn one day, and I'm going to discuss this in part 5. But before I talk about what is coming, I'm going to discuss the 501c3 in part 3. And I will talk about the fact that churches are automatically tax exempt under our Constitution and do not need a 501c3 to be tax exempt. And those who give to churches automatically qualify for tax deductions without a church taking a 501c3. So I want to thank you for joining me for part 2 of this 6-part video series. And again, please like, subscribe, and share this video. And tune into part 3 when I talk about the 501c3. Thank you, and God bless. Hey everyone, thanks for watching this edition of Agape Lifecast. And whether you're watching this on Facebook or YouTube, I ask that you do me a favor. Please like the video and share it. And if you haven't already done so, please like the Agape Lifecast Facebook page and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, may God richly bless you and keep you.